Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Alice who was sitting with her sister on the riverbank. It was a warm day, and Alice was feeling quite bored as her sister read a book that didn't seem to have any pictures or conversations in it. As Alice began to daydream, a strange sight caught her eye. A white rabbit with pink eyes hurried past her, muttering to himself and checking a pocket watch. The rabbit seemed to be in a terrible hurry, and Alice, intrigued by the sight of a talking rabbit, decided to follow him. Alice chased the rabbit across a field until he suddenly disappeared down a rabbit hole. Without hesitation, Alice followed him and found herself tumbling down a deep and mysterious tunnel. The fall was long and slow, almost like floating. And as she descended, Alice passed shelves filled with jars, maps, and other curious items. She even had time to think about where she might end up, and wondered if she would come out on the other side of the earth. Finally, after what felt like forever, Alice landed gently at the bottom. She found herself in a hallway lined with many doors, all of which were locked. As Alice explored, she discovered a small key on a glass table and a tiny door hidden behind a curtain. However, when she tried to open the door, she realized she was too big to fit through. Nearby, she saw a bottle labeled "Drink Me." After making sure it wasn't poisonous, Alice took a sip. To her astonishment, she began to shrink until she was small enough to fit through the door. However, Alice had forgotten the key on the table, and now she was too small to reach it. As she grew frustrated, she noticed a cake with a label that read, "Eat Me." She took a small bite, and suddenly she began to grow and grow until she was enormous. She filled the room, her head nearly touching the ceiling. Alice felt trapped and overwhelmed by her size and began to cry. Her giant tears formed a pool around her. Just then, the white rabbit appeared again, still in a hurry. Alice tried to talk to him, but he seemed too flustered to notice her. She picked up a fan that the rabbit had dropped, and as she waved it, she began to shrink again. Alice shrank down so much that she fell into the pool of tears she had cried earlier. Swimming through the salty pool, Alice encountered a mouse who was also swimming. She tried to make conversation with him, but accidentally frightened him by talking about her cat, Dinah. The mouse swam away, and Alice continued through the water, meeting other creatures who had fallen into the pool. Eventually, they all made it to shore, and Alice joined the animals in a caucus race, a chaotic event where everyone ran in circles and no one seemed to win. After the race, Alice felt lonely again. She wandered off and soon came across the white rabbit, who mistook her for his maid, Mary Ann. He ordered her to go to his house and fetch his gloves and fan. Eager to help, Alice went to the rabbit's house. Inside, she found another bottle labeled "Drink Me," and curious as always, she took a drink. This time, Alice grew so large that she filled the entire house, her arms and legs sticking out of the windows and doors. The white rabbit and his friends were horrified and tried to get Alice out by throwing pebbles through the window. The pebbles turned into little cakes, and when Alice ate one, she shrank back down to her normal size. She quickly fled the house and ran into the woods, where she encountered a large Cheshire cat sitting in a tree. The Cheshire cat had a wide, mischievous grin and could appear and disappear at will. He told Alice that everyone in Wonderland was mad, including himself. He suggested that Alice visit either the March Hare or the Mad Hatter, both of whom were hosting tea parties. With that, the Cheshire Cat vanished, leaving only his grin behind. Alice decided to visit the March Hare and soon arrived at his house, where she found the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and a sleepy dormouse having tea at a very large table. The tea party was unlike any Alice had ever seen. The table was set with teacups and plates, but the guests were constantly moving from one seat to another, claiming there was no room for Alice, even though there was plenty of space. The Mad Hatter and the March Hare were both very rude, interrupting Alice and speaking in riddles that made no sense. The dormouse kept falling asleep and waking up to tell strange stories. Alice tried to join in, but soon became frustrated with the nonsensical conversation. The tea party guests ignored time, and the Mad Hatter explained that it was always tea time for them because time had stopped at 6 o'clock. Feeling confused and a little annoyed, Alice decided to leave the tea party and continue her adventure. As she wandered through Wonderland, Alice came across a beautiful garden filled with rose bushes. To her surprise, some of the roses were being painted red by a group of playing cards. When Alice asked why they were painting the roses, the cards explained that the Queen of Hearts had ordered red roses, but they had accidentally planted white ones. If the Queen found out, they feared she would punish them. Before Alice could ask more questions, the Queen of Hearts arrived with her entourage, which included the King of Hearts and a procession of playing cards. The Queen was a terrifying ruler who constantly shouted, "Off with their heads," at anyone who displeased her. The Queen invited Alice to play a game of croquet, but the game was far from ordinary. Instead of regular mallets, they used flamingos, and instead of balls, they used hedgehogs. The game was chaotic, as the flamingos and hedgehogs refused to cooperate, and the playing cards, acting as the hoops, kept moving around. During the game, Alice noticed the Cheshire Cat reappearing in the sky, grinning down at her. The Queen saw the Cheshire Cat and became enraged, demanding that he be beheaded. However, since the Cheshire Cat could make his body disappear, only his head was left floating in the air, and no one knew how to behead a floating head. Eventually, the king suggested asking the Duchess, who was the Cheshire Cat's owner, to help resolve the situation. After the chaotic croquet game, the Queen of Hearts took Alice to meet the Mock Turtle, a sad and melancholy creature who told Alice stories about his past. The Mock Turtle, along with his friend the Griffin, taught Alice the Lobster Quadrille, a strange dance involving lobsters, sea creatures, and humans. Though the dance was odd, Alice enjoyed spending time with the creatures and listening to their stories. As they danced, the Griffin suddenly announced that there was to be a trial, and they all hurried back to the court. When Alice arrived, she saw that the Knave of Hearts was on trial for stealing the Queen's tarts. The jury was made up of various animals, and the courtroom was full of playing cards. The trial was absurd, with nonsensical evidence being presented, including a letter that no one could read. The Queen of Hearts was determined to find the knave guilty, but the king tried to follow the rules of the court, even though he seemed more interested in keeping the Queen happy. As the trial went on, Alice found herself growing larger and larger until she was towering over everyone in the courtroom. The Queen, furious with the turn of events, shouted, "Off with her head!" But Alice, no longer afraid, stood up and declared, "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At that moment, the playing cards rose up into the air and came flying toward Alice. She tried to swat them away, but suddenly she woke up. Alice was no longer in Wonderland. She was back on the riverbank with her sister, and everything was as it had been before. Alice realized that her entire adventure had been a strange and wonderful dream. Though the characters and places she had encountered were bizarre and confusing, it had all been part of her imagination. Smiling to herself, Alice got up and walked home with her sister, ready to share the stories of her fantastic dream. The end. Like and subscribe to Bedtime Stories in 10 minutes.